So altruism, right? Helping others. It's good. It's like a universal good thing, isn't it?
Well, you'd think so, wouldn't you? I mean, it's like ingrained in us to think that way. But then you come across something like that quote from Ian McGilchrist,
About good things going bad. Yeah, that one always sticks with me. It's a bit unsettling, actually.
because it makes you question these assumptions we have. Like, are we just fooling ourselves?
Well, that's what we're going to dig into today, right? The not so sunny side of altruism. And you've brought some really interesting material to guide our deep dive today.
Yeah, I thought this was particularly relevant. So we've got the first 4 chapters here, really getting into the psychology behind what they call pathological altruism. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but the idea itself is pretty fascinating. And strangely, it's not something we talk about much.
No, not at all. And I think a lot of people might not even be aware that this concept exists, that helping could actually be harmful. But this deep dive, that's exactly what we're aiming for. Pulling out the most important bits from these chapters, looking at how this empathy-based guilt can actually go wrong, how our own thinking patterns and habits can contribute to it, and even the link to codependency.
Because the thing is, this stuff isn't just theoretical. It has real-world implications for individuals, families, even for whole societies.
Absolutely. We see it all the time, even if we don't always recognize it.
And hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a much clearer understanding without having to wade through all the academic jargon.
That's the goal. All right, so chapter 1 lays the groundwork, sets the stage, but chapter 2 is where things start to get really interesting. They jump right into this idea of empathy, which on the surface seems like a good thing, right?
Absolutely. It's kind of the foundation of our ability to connect with each other, to understand each other.
But the book highlights that it's not that simple. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
No, because you've got healthy empathy, which leads to genuine beneficial altruism. But then you have these kind of warped versions of empathy, and that's where things can start to go off the rails.
And that's where we get into this idea of pathological altruism.
Right, right. And the chapter really digs into how that initial, almost automatic empathic reaction we have when we see someone struggling, that can very quickly turn into this feeling of, like, implicit guilt. Like we should be doing something to fix it.
It's like this internal pressure, right? You see someone in pain, and you almost automatically feel responsible in a way.
And it ties into our sense of fairness and equality. Like, if I'm doing okay and you're not, there's this inherent sense that something's wrong, that it's somehow unfair.
Which makes sense to an extent, but then it can get really messy.
Because then we get to this concept of survivor guilt, or sometimes called inequity guilt. And this is where it becomes what they call pathogenic, meaning it's not just guilt, it's guilt that's actually causing harm.
Okay, so how does normal guilt become this harmful pathogenic guilt?
The chapter describes it as this feeling that your own well-being, just the fact that you're doing okay, is somehow the cause of someone else's suffering.
Wow, just by comparison.
Just by comparison, it's like you feel like you're cheating, Like you don't deserve to be happy while someone else is struggling.
That's got to be a really heavy burden to carry.
It is. And that's where the link to pathological altruism becomes really clear.
Because you're so driven by this guilt, by this need to fix things, that you end up doing things that are actually harmful.
Exactly. It's not about genuinely helping anymore. It's about alleviating your own discomfort, often at the expense of the person you're supposedly trying to help. And the crazy thing is, it can even harm you in the process.
It's like this vicious cycle, right?
Totally. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it actually makes a weird kind of sense. Like empathy and guilt, they're kind of these built-in mechanisms for social cohesion, meaning that a group where individuals feel a sense of responsibility for each other, even if it sometimes means sacrificing individual well-being, might be more likely to survive. It's about the group as a whole, not just the individuals within it.
So it makes sense from like a big picture standpoint, but on a personal level, it can get really distorted.
Exactly. Okay, so now we're getting into chapter 3. And this one takes a slightly different approach. It looks at pathological altruism through the lens of what's called relational frame theory.
Relational frame theory. Okay. That sounds a little intimidating.
I know, right? But it's actually not as complicated as it sounds. It's basically about how we use language to make connections between things and how those connections influence our behavior.
So like our understanding of one thing is based on how it relates to other things.
Precisely. Think of it like that monkey with the food piles. It learns to go for the bigger pile of food.
Makes sense.
But if you suddenly introduce an even bigger pile, its understanding of the first pile changes.
It's not just about the absolute size anymore. It's about the relative size.
Exactly. And that's relational responding in action. And the same thing can happen with our idea of being good.
How so?
Well, we learn to associate certain behaviors with being a good person, like helping others, self-sacrifice, putting others first. But these associations can become so rigid, so ingrained, that they actually blind us to the bigger picture.
So we end up doing things that we think are good, but they're actually causing harm because we're so stuck in this rigid way of thinking.
Exactly. And this theory talks about different levels of something called deictic framing, which is basically about perspective taking.
Okay, so how many levels are there?
Well, they outline three main levels. Level one is like basic perspective taking, I versus you, here versus there, now versus then. Pretty straightforward stuff.
Right, the fundamentals.
Then you've got level two, which involves something called the transformation of functions based on these different perspectives. So understanding that something that feels good to me might feel bad to you because we're coming from different places.
Being able to see things from someone else's point of view.
Exactly. And level three is about having a stable sense of self that can navigate all these different perspectives without getting lost in them. It's about being able to hold multiple viewpoints at the same time and act accordingly.
And I guess that flexibility is what allows us to have healthy relationships and make good decisions.
Absolutely. The research even suggests that well-developed perspective-taking skills are linked to things like pro-social behavior, reduced delinquency, increased social competence. So it's pretty important stuff.
So how does this all tie back to empathic concern and pathological altruism?
Well, alongside understanding other perspectives,
Yeah.
you get this other aspect, empathic concern. And this is where you're not just understanding someone else's feelings, you're actually affected by them. You feel something in response.
Which can be a good thing, right? It allows us to connect on a deeper level.
Yeah, in a healthy context.
Yeah.
But it can also lead to what's called negative arousal, like those unpleasant feelings that come up when we're exposed to someone else's pain.
And for some people, that can be really overwhelming.
Absolutely. And that can lead to experiential avoidance, where people try to avoid those uncomfortable feelings at all costs. So they might avoid watching the news, or they might distance themselves from people who are struggling.
Because it's just too much to handle.
Exactly. And this is where our sense of self comes into play, our conceptualized self, which is basically the image we have of who we are.
How we see ourselves.
Exactly. So if someone strongly identifies as a helpful person, they might experience really intense negative feelings at the thought of not helping someone.
Because it would go against their self-image.
Right. And this can lead to a really rigid way of behaving. Like, if I don't help, I'm a bad person, so I have to help, even if it's not actually helpful or even wanted.
Wow. So the very desire to be seen as a good person can actually lead to harmful behavior.
That's the paradox. And this is where relational frame theory helps us understand pathological altruism in a new light. It's not just about being too nice. It's about these rigid patterns of behavior that are driven by a need to avoid negative feelings and maintain a certain self-image.
Okay, so it's a lot more complex than we might initially think. Then chapter 4 brings in another layer to all of this, codependency.
And codependency, at its core, is often described as this difficulty in tolerating negative affect in other people. It leads to these dysfunctional empathic responses where you're so focused on fixing the other person's problems that you completely neglect your own needs.
And the book suggests there might be a connection between codependency and pathological altruism.
Yeah, the authors see a strong potential link there. There are a lot of shared characteristics,
Yeah.
this heightened sensitivity to other people's distress, the strong urge to alleviate it, even if it's not actually helpful.
And it can be really hard to separate the two, right? Because they often show up in very similar ways.
And the chapter digs into the evolutionary, genetic, and even neurological factors that might be at play.
It's fascinating, isn't it? These very things that are supposed to help us connect and create strong bonds can also become sources of dysfunction.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Hmm.
But I think one thing that's important to acknowledge here is that the term codependency itself can be a bit slippery. There isn't one universally accepted definition.
Right, I've noticed that. It seems like it's used in a lot of different ways, and sometimes it's not even clear what people are really talking about.
Exactly. And the chapter even points out how tricky it is to separate the solid research from the more anecdotal stuff, especially when it comes to codependency. You see these claims about millions of people being codependent, but a lot of those claims aren't actually backed up by good evidence.
Like that example you mentioned about the nursing publication from the 90s. The one that estimated, was it 40 million Americans were codependent? And it was based on some random workplace study.
Yeah, that one always gets me.
It highlights how important it is to be critical of the information we come across.
Absolutely. But there are some attempts to measure codependency in a more systematic way, like the Holyoke Codependency Index.
Right, the HCI, what's that all about?
It was developed in Australia, actually, mainly in the context of substance abuse treatment. It's basically a questionnaire that looks at three main areas: external focus, self-sacrifice, and reactivity.
So, relying on others for your sense of worth, putting their needs above your own, and feeling like you're constantly controlled by their moods.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And while it's helpful for identifying certain tendencies, it's important to remember that it was developed in a very specific context.
So, it might not capture the whole picture of codependency.
Right. It's a starting point, but not the whole story.
Oh.
Now, getting back to the biological roots, the chapter talks about how empathy, which is really at the heart of altruism, is very much tied to parental care.
That makes sense. We see that across so many species. This intense bond between parent and offspring.
Yeah, and it's not just a one-way street. Like that infant smile, that's a huge reinforcement for parental care. There's even research showing that newborns are born with this ability to recognize and prefer their mother's face.
We come into the world ready to connect, at least with our primary caregivers.
But then when you start to extend that helping behavior beyond your immediate family, the evolutionary rationale becomes a bit less clear.
Because there's not that direct genetic benefit anymore.
Right, and that's what we often think of as true altruism, where you're helping someone you're not related to and you don't expect anything in return. And the chapter suggests that codependency might actually tap into some of the same neural pathways that are involved in these really close, intimate bonds.
Like the bond between a mother and child or romantic partners.
Exactly, because when someone we're really close to is struggling, it tends to trigger a much stronger empathic response in us. And codependency often involves this blurring of boundaries, this difficulty in thinking clearly about the situation.
Which can be similar to what happens when we're in love, right? We can be blinded by our emotions.
Totally. And then you've got these neurochemicals, oxytocin and vasopressin, that are heavily involved in all of this.
Those are the ones that always come up when we talk about love and bonding, right?
Yeah, oxytocin is often called the love hormone, and it's linked to social decision-making, reducing anxiety, promoting social interaction. And there's even evidence that our genes play a role in how we respond to oxytocin. Like the genes related to oxytocin receptors can actually influence our tendency to make pro-social choices.
That's pretty wild.
It is. And then you've got vasopressin, which is also involved in regulating social behavior, bonding, attachment. But it can also be linked to things like aggression and stress response.
So it's a bit more of a mixed bag than oxytocin.
Yeah, it's not quite as straightforward. But the idea is that when someone with codependent tendencies recognizes negative emotions in another person, it can trigger a release of these neurochemicals, and that can lead to this surge in pro-social behavior, even if it's not actually helpful in the long run.
So it's like their emotional response is overriding their better judgment.
Exactly. And what seems to be missing is that ability to set healthy boundaries, what they call cognitive empathy, where you can understand the situation without getting completely swept up in the emotions of it,
So it's like the emotional part of the brain is hijacking the rational part.
basically. And the chapter concludes that codependency might be this inability to tolerate negative affect in someone else, which leads to these short-term actions that actually enable the dysfunctional behavior to continue, even when the person knows it's not helpful.
It's like they're trapped in this cycle of trying to fix things, but they're actually making things worse in the process.
Right. And while there are some psychological explanations for these tendencies, like low self-esteem and dependency needs, the chapter really emphasizes the role of genetics and evolution. It's not just about learned behaviors. There's a strong biological component to all of this.
And that's something that's often overlooked, right? We tend to think of these things as purely psychological, but there's a whole other layer of complexity beneath the surface.
And it's important to remember that codependency can be very relationship specific. Someone might show codependent tendencies in one relationship, but not in others.
It's not like a fixed personality trait. It's more nuanced than that.
Definitely. So to kind of sum up the main takeaways from these first 4 chapters, we've seen how empathy, while being essential for connection, can also have this dark side. It can be twisted by guilt and lead to harmful behavior.
We've also learned how our own thought patterns and habits, as explained by relational frame theory, can really contribute to this.
And then we explored this fascinating link between codependency and pathological altruism, and how these deep-seated biological mechanisms might be driving a lot of this behavior.
It really highlights that these seemingly simple acts of kindness are actually rooted in a really complex interplay of emotions, thoughts, and biology.
And it challenges us to really think critically about the nature of helping.
Because it's not always as straightforward as we think it is.
It forces us to ask ourselves, where does healthy helping end, and where does it cross over into something potentially harmful?
And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. As you go about your day, as you interact with others, pay attention to those moments where helping is involved. And ask yourself, what are the motivations behind those actions, both your own and those of others? Where might there be some of these hidden dynamics at play? It's a question that's worth pondering, and one that we'll continue to explore in our future deep dives. We always think of altruism, as this really positive thing, like
Yeah.
helping others. It's good, right? But what if I told you there was like a dark side to it?
Ooh, a dark side.
Yeah, like that urge to be good, to help people, that it could actually go bad. I think it was Ian McGilchrist who said a good thing going bad. And I think that's what we're kind of looking at today, this weird puzzle of how something good can take a bad turn.
Absolutely. And for our listeners out there who really want to understand, how things work, we're diving deep into, well, what happens when altruism becomes pathological?
Hmm.
We've got some writings here that really unpack this.
Okay, so we're zeroing in on part 2 of the material, which
Nice.
gets into like the psychology of it all.
Oh, nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about self-addiction and what was it? Self-righteousness.
Oh, yeah. Self-righteousness, that's a big one.
We'll also be looking at how this all ties into personality disorders, eating disorders, even animal hoarding.
Right. And we'll wrap up with a look at Williams syndrome, which presents a really unique angle on all of this.
So yeah, get ready to rethink what it means to be good.
It's not always so simple, is it?
No, not at all. Okay, so chapter 5 jumps right into this idea of self-addiction and self-righteousness.
Right.
And the author, David Brin, he suggests that we need to broaden our view of addiction. It's not just about substances.
Right. He's talking about mental states, too.
Yeah. So, we talk about being addicted to our phones or gambling, but Brin is saying that things like meditation or even feeling really angry can be addictive.
Yeah. Even that sense of being morally superior, self-righteousness, can become addictive.
So it's like our brains get this reward, this little ding when we experience certain things.
A hit of dopamine. It feels good.
Exactly. And Brin says that feeling morally superior can trigger that same rush.
So if you get a buzz from feeling like you're the good guy, you might subconsciously seek out situations that give you that feeling again and again.
And that's where it gets really interesting how this relates to pathological altruism.
Oh, yeah.
Because Brin's saying that sometimes what looks like selfless behavior, like helping others, is really driven by this need to feel self-righteous.
So it's not actually about the other person. It's about making yourself feel good.
Exactly. It's a bit of a mind bender, isn't it?
It is. It really makes you question people's motivations. Are they genuinely trying to help, or are they just feeding their own ego?
And Brin thinks that this perspective, seeing self-righteousness as a kind of addiction, could help groups that are trying to solve problems. Sometimes people get so stuck in their beliefs that they can't actually make progress.
Right. If we can understand that some people are essentially addicted to being right, it might help us find ways to bridge those divides and actually work together.
Yeah. And, it makes you think about those toxic debates you see online.
Oh, yeah. So much anger and righteousness.
Is it really about the issue, or is it about something else?
That's the question, isn't it? Now, Brin also talks about how a lot of what we call altruistic behavior in nature isn't really altruistic at all.
How so?
Well, he says that a lot of it is about self-preservation or helping your kin, or it's part of some reciprocal system.
Like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Exactly. So he suggests that true altruism, the kind that goes beyond those basic instincts, is probably a fairly recent development in our evolution.
And he links it to intelligence. He thinks it's a sign of higher intelligence.
Which is fascinating because it's just that our capacity for altruism is tied to our ability to think abstractly and empathize with others.
Yeah, to see beyond our immediate needs. But Brin also points out that this kind of altruism can sometimes go too far.
It can become pathological.
Right.
And he brings up this interesting concept of toxic memes.
Oh, yes. Toxic memes. That's a thought-provoking one.
So he's talking about the idea that some ideas can be inherently dangerous, like a virus.
Right. and they can spread quickly through a population, causing all sorts of harm. And he points out that while we, like in Western society, we tend to reject the idea that some ideas should be censored or that there should be some elite group controlling what people think.
Right. We value freedom of speech.
But a lot of other cultures throughout history have believed in the power of dangerous ideas. They've had ways of controlling what people are exposed to.
So it's interesting to think about, how we deal with potentially harmful ideas in a world where information spreads so rapidly.
Yeah. And Bryn even ties this into how we think about extraterrestrial intelligence. We often just assume that advanced civilizations will be altruistic.
We project our own hopes onto them.
Yeah. But what if they've encountered these toxic memes?
What if they've had to develop ways to protect themselves from dangerous ideas?
It really makes you question our assumptions about what an advanced civilization would be like.
It does. And it makes you wonder if our own tendency towards altruism is as pure and innocent as we like to think.
Hmm. Okay, let's move on to Chapter 6, which looks at pathological altruism through the lens of personality disorders.
Right. So we're getting into the clinical side of things now.
Yeah. And the authors, Weidiger and Presnell, they connect pathological altruism to dependent personality disorder, or DPD.
Okay.
And they also link it to maladaptive agreeableness.
Now, that might sound a bit strange, right? Because being agreeable is usually seen as a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't like someone who's nice and helpful?
But Weidiger and Presnell are saying that agreeableness can become a problem when it's taken to an extreme.
So it's like there's a healthy level of agreeableness, and then there's a level that's actually harmful.
Exactly. And they point out that the typical ways we measure agreeableness, like with personality tests, tend to focus on the healthy side of it.
So it's like the scale is only measuring the good part, but it's not capturing when agreeableness becomes excessive or starts to hurt the person.
Right. So how do you measure that dark side of agreeableness?
Well, some researchers actually changed the questions in a personality test to try and capture that.
Interesting. What did they do?
For example, they took a statement like, I go out of my way to help others if I can.
Okay.
Then they changed it to something like, I have sacrificed my own needs to help others.
So they're highlighting the self-sacrificing aspect of it.
Exactly. And what they found was that when they measured agreeableness in this way, it was much more strongly linked to dependent personality disorder.
So it's not just about being nice, it's about consistently putting others' needs before your own, even to your own detriment.
Right. And they even have a case study in the chapter about a woman named Sophia.
Tell me about Sophia.
So Sophia, she scored really high on altruism on a standard personality test.
So on the surface, she seemed like a very kind and giving person.
Yeah. But then they used a more in-depth interview that was designed to uncover these maladaptive personality traits.
Okay.
And it turned out that Sophia had this long history of self-sacrifice.
She was always putting others first, even when it meant hurting herself.
Yeah. And she ended up being taken advantage of and exploited because of it.
So it's a cautionary tale, really.
It is. It shows how pathological altruism can be linked to these deep-seated personality patterns. It's not just about isolated incidents. It's about a way of being in the world.
A way of relating to others that's ultimately harmful to yourself.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about Chapter 7, which looks at the relevance of pathological altruism to eating disorders.
Okay. That's an interesting connection.
Yeah, it's not an obvious one at first, but when you think about it, it makes sense.
Oh, so?
Well, one of the key things about eating disorders is this tendency to prioritize the needs of others over your own.
So instead of listening to your body's cues about hunger and fullness, you're more focused on what other people think you should eat or how you should look.
Exactly. It's like your internal compass is broken or it's being overridden by external pressures.
Right. And the chapter brings in some really interesting perspectives from researchers who've studied eating disorders.
Yeah, like Hilda Brush, who talked about how women with anorexia often become really good at reading other people's cues about how they should feel and behave.
So their sense of self-worth is based on external validation rather than on their own internal feelings.
Right. And then there's Vitusek and Ebald, who emphasized how genetics and environment can interact to create this difficulty in developing a strong sense of self.
It's like they never really developed that core feeling of, I know what's right for me.
Yeah. And then there's Boskin Lodo, who talked about the role of cultural and societal pressures in contributing to this lack of identity in girls who develop eating disorders.
So they're bombarded with messages about how they should look and act, and they end up internalizing those messages and losing sight of who they really are.
Right. And Schubeck-Newberg and Nemiroff had a similar view on bulimia. They said that there's often this absence of a true self underlying the condition.
So again, it's this lack of a strong internal compass, a sense of who you are and what you need.
And when we bring this back to pathological altruism, what we see is this extreme form of putting others first. It's like their need to please or conform becomes so powerful that it overrides their own basic needs.
So instead of nourishing their own bodies, they're more focused on meeting the expectations of others, even if those expectations are harmful.
Right. It's a really sad and complex situation.
It is. And it highlights how these seemingly different conditions, pathological altruism and eating disorders, can share this common thread of a diminished sense of self.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to chapter 8, which is about animal hoarding. This is a really tough one.
Oh yeah, animal hoarding is heartbreaking.
Because the initial motivation often seems so pure. You know, these people want to rescue animals, they want to give them a good life.
But then it spirals out of control.
It does. And the chapter explains how, for some people, animals become this incredibly important source of identity and self-esteem.
Especially if they're struggling with human relationships.
Right. The animals can provide this unconditional love and companionship that they're not getting from other people.
And there's a kind of trajectory that the chapter outlines for how this develops.
Okay.
So it often starts with early problems with attachment, maybe difficulty forming secure bonds with caregivers.
Right.
And then there's often a tendency towards excessive caregiving, even codependency in relationships.
Okay.
And then something happens, some kind of loss or trauma that triggers this escalating pattern of acquiring more and more animals.
So it's like they're trying to fill this void in their lives with animals.
Exactly. And they create this isolated world with their animals where they feel needed and loved.
But the tragic thing is that they end up neglecting the animal's basic needs.
Right. The animals often live in horrible conditions, overcrowded, filthy, with no access to proper veterinary care.
And the hoarders often refuse to acknowledge that there's a problem.
They're in denial.
Yeah. And they resist any attempts at intervention.
It's really sad.
It is. Because their initial good intentions have become so twisted and distorted.
It's a prime example of how pathological altruism can actually be incredibly cruel.
Yeah. And the chapter even mentions that some animal hoarders might experience dissociative symptoms.
Wow. So there's a real disconnect from reality going on?
It's a really complex and disturbing phenomenon.
It is. It really makes you think about the dark side of compassion.
Yeah. Okay, let's finish up with chapter 9, which looks at Williams syndrome.
Oh, Williams syndrome. That's a fascinating one.
Yeah, it's a genetic disorder, and people with Williams syndrome are often described as being extremely friendly and outgoing.
They're very sociable.
Yeah, and they often seem to have a lot of empathy.
So on the surface, they seem like the embodiment of altruism.
Right. But researchers have been trying to figure out if their social behavior is driven by the same mechanisms as in people without the syndrome.
So is their friendliness genuine, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's the question. And some research suggests that people with Williams syndrome might actually experience less anxiety in social situations than people without the syndrome.
So they're not inhibited by the same fears and worries that most of us experience.
Exactly. And that might explain why they're so approachable and eager to connect with others.
But it also raises the question of whether their social behavior is truly altruistic or if it's more a product of their unique neurology.
Right. It's like, are they being friendly because they genuinely care about other people or because their brains are wired in a way that makes them less fearful of social interaction?
It's a really thought-provoking question.
It is, and it shows how complex and nuanced altruism can be.
Yeah. It's not always easy to determine what's motivating someone's behavior.
No, it's not. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this deep dive.
Absolutely.
We've seen how something that we usually think of as positive, like altruism, can actually have this dark side.
And we've explored how it can be driven by all sorts of factors, from self-addiction to personality disorders to genetics.
And we've seen how it can manifest in really harmful ways, both for the person who's being altruistic and for the people they're trying to help.
So it's a call to be more mindful, to look beneath the surface and consider the potential consequences of our actions, even when we're trying to do good.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, if our society's view of altruism is a bit too simplistic.
We tend to romanticize it, don't we?
Yeah, but maybe we need to be more critical to question our assumptions and really think about what's driving our own behavior and the behavior of others.
Absolutely. It's a complex topic that deserves a lot more attention and discussion.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought. We've talked about how altruism can be harmful, but it's also important to remember that it's a powerful force for good in the world. So the challenge for us is to figure out how to harness that power in a way that's both beneficial and sustainable. How can we be altruistic in a way that helps others without harming ourselves or creating unintended consequences?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's one that we all need to be thinking about. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we hope it's given you some food for thought.
Absolutely. Until next time.
All right, welcome to another deep dive. You know how this works, right? You send us the stuff you're curious about, and we dive in deep. And today, we're going deep on something that might just make you rethink a few things, maybe even some things you thought were pretty straightforward good. Pathological Altruism. It's a book edited by Barbara Oakley.
Yeah, it really gets you thinking about stuff we usually just assume is good, like helping others, being kind, all that good stuff. But then it goes and flips the script. Like, what if those good intentions actually end up causing some, not so good outcomes?
Yeah, and we're going even deeper, right? Focusing on a specific part of the book. It's called Societal Implications of Pathological Altruism. That's chapters 10 through 21. So we're really looking at the big picture here, how this whole pathological altruism thing can ripple out and affect society as a whole.
Absolutely. It's not just about individual quirks. It's about how those individual quirks, those good intentions gone awry, can play out on a much larger scale. And that's where things get really interesting. It may be a little unsettling.
Oh, yeah. Unsettling, for sure. So, chapter 10 kicks things off with this idea of pathological certitude. Now, I'm guessing this isn't just about being a know-it-all.
No, it's deeper than that. It's about this thing called the feeling of knowing. It's like, when something just clicks, like you suddenly understand something perfectly or you recognize something instantly. That's the feeling of knowing. It happens kind of automatically without you really thinking about it consciously.
Like you just know it, right? It feels right in your gut.
Exactly. And the thing is, that feeling, that sense of certainty, it can really influence our moral choices. Like, we might get this really strong feeling that being kind to absolutely everyone, no matter what they do, is the only way to be a good person.
Yeah.
And it feels so right, so undeniably true that we don't even question it.
Which, on the surface, that sounds pretty great. Like, who wouldn't want to be kind to everyone? But that's where the whole pathological part comes in, right?
Right. It's like, what if that unwavering certainty, even about something we consider virtuous, leads us to do things that actually end up being harmful? Like, imagine you're so convinced you know what's best for a friend that you keep pushing your help on them, even when they clearly don't want it. Or think about a doctor who's absolutely certain that aggressive treatment is always the right choice, even for a patient who's really suffering and might actually benefit more from comfort care. That's the danger of pathological certitude. It can make us blind to the potential negative consequences of our actions, even when we're convinced we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's kind of a mind bender. Okay, so then chapter 11, altruism and suffering and cancer. That sounds, pretty heavy.
It is. It's specifically about how this whole pathological altruism thing plays out when you're talking about caring for people with cancer.
Yeah.
And it gets into these different types of pathological altruism, which I think is really helpful for understanding the nuances here.
Okay, so what kinds of different types are we talking about?
They break it down into three main categories. The first is like, okay, you're super concerned about other people and your actions actually do benefit them. But the cost to you, the altruist, is huge. Like you're basically destroying yourself in the process of helping. Imagine a caregiver who gives so much of themselves to a loved one with cancer that they completely neglect their own health. They end up getting sick, burning out, even dying. That's one type.
Yeah, I can see that. It's like they're so focused on helping that they forget about themselves entirely.
Right. Then there's this other type called misdirected altruism. In this case, the actions are meant to help, but they're actually totally ineffective or even counterproductive for the person receiving the help. Like you might have someone who's constantly giving unsolicited advice to a cancer patient. They think they're being supportive, but the patient might find it really upsetting or just completely irrelevant to their needs.
Oh, yeah, I can definitely see that happening. Good intentions, but, not really helpful in practice.
Exactly. And then The third type, which is more extreme, like suicide bombing, the book uses that as an example, where you have destructive actions that are driven by a belief that they'll ultimately lead to some greater good for a larger group or cause.
Right, right. Okay, so focusing back on cancer care, where does that fit in? It's obviously not suicide bombing.
No, no, not at all. But it can definitely fall into those first two categories. When the caregiver ends up sacrificing their own well-being to the point where it's unsustainable, that's the first type. And when the help, even though it's meant well, ends up not actually benefiting the patient or even making things worse for them, that's the second type.
It's a tough balance, isn't it? Like, how do you help someone without losing yourself in the process or accidentally making things harder for them?
Totally. And the chapter brings up this really fundamental question. It's like, how can we ever be totally sure that our motivations for helping are pure? How do we separate our own desire to be helpful from maybe a less conscious need to feel needed or to be in control?
Whoa, that's deep. Okay, so then we get to chapter 12, which brings together, get this, therapeutic jurisprudence and neuroscience perspectives. That's a mouthful.
It is. It's basically about how neuroscience, like brain scans and stuff, might be able to help us understand the whole empathy and trust thing, which are obviously super important for altruism.
Right, right. So are they saying we can actually see altruism happening in the brain? Like, is there an altruism spot they can point to?
Well, not exactly a specific altruism spot, but they do talk about research suggesting that brain scans can actually predict, to some extent, whether someone's going to make an altruistic choice in a given situation. And they can even show brain activity that's linked to our willingness to punish people who cheat or break the rules, even if it costs us something to do so.
Wow, that's pretty wild. Like, you can actually see the brain lighting up when someone's making a moral decision.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. But the chapter also gets into all the debate about using these brain scans in legal settings. Like, can we really reduce something as complex as altruism to a brain scan? And what about the potential to sway juries? A brain scan can seem pretty convincing, even if the interpretation is complicated and not totally clear-cut.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem. Okay, what about this therapeutic jurisprudence thing? What's that all about?
So therapeutic jurisprudence, it's basically a way of looking at the law that goes beyond just the rules and punishments. It's about considering how legal practices and decisions actually affect the people involved, their psychological and emotional well-being. It's like trying to make the law more, well, therapeutic, or at least minimize any negative psychological effects.
Okay, so how does this all tie back to pathological altruism?
Well, they bring up the concept of cultural defense in law, and how this idea of pathological altruism has been used in certain situations, like cases involving battered women in Japan. Basically, the argument is that in some cultures, there are these really strong expectations of self-sacrifice and endurance, and adhering to those expectations, even when it's harmful, could be seen as a form of pathological altruism.
So it's like their cultural background is almost forcing them into this self-destructive behavior.
Yeah, it's complex for sure, and it raises all sorts of questions about individual responsibility versus cultural influence and how those factors play out in the legal system.
Okay, on to chapter 13. It lays out a behaviorally oriented motivational typology of pathological altruists. So they're categorizing people based on their motivations for being, well, pathologically altruistic. What are these different motivational types?
Right, they basically break it down based on what's driving the behavior. First, they talk about something called defensive altruism.
Defensive altruism.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of contradictory. How can helping others be a defense mechanism?
Well, the idea is that for some people, being super helpful, like excessively helpful, can be a way of dealing with their own inner conflicts, like feelings of guilt or inadequacy. It's like they're overcompensating, trying to maintain a positive self-image by focusing on helping others.
So it's less about genuine empathy and more about managing their own stuff.
Exactly. Then they talk about masochistic altruism, and this gets into some pretty heavy psychological territory. This is about people who have this underlying need to suffer, to be the victim. Their altruistic behaviors, like sacrificing themselves for others, become a way of fulfilling that need. It's like they don't believe they deserve happiness, so they seek out suffering.
Man, that sounds rough. Are there different ways that can play out?
Yeah, they talk about psychotic and non-psychotic manifestations. And what's interesting is that the behaviors, like constantly putting others' needs before their own, can look pretty similar in both. The difference is in the underlying psychological stuff, like whether there's a disconnect from reality in the psychotic cases.
Right, right. They also use a real-life example here, don't they? The case of Jan Hasegawa.
Yeah. It's a pretty tragic case. Jan was in an abusive relationship, and she constantly gave in to her partner's demands, even when it put her in danger. It was like she had this need to be the victim, to suffer for him. It's a really heartbreaking example of how this masochistic altruism can play out.
Yeah, that's heavy stuff. Okay, so what's the last category in this motivational typology?
The last one is risky altruism. This one seems to be linked to certain personality traits, like sensation seeking, being outgoing, open to new experiences. People who are high in risky altruism might be more likely to put themselves in dangerous situations to help others without really thinking through the consequences for themselves.
So they're kind of impulsive, thrill-seeking altruists.
Yeah, something like that. And there's actually research showing that people high in risky altruism are more likely to become victims of crime, even when you take into account other personality and demographic factors.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, skipping ahead to chapter 15, we're getting into the really intense topic of lethal altruism, the case of suicide attacks. This is where things get, well, really dark.
It does. They define lethal altruism as this extreme destructive twist on our natural tendencies to help others. And they tie it to concepts like strong altruism, where people make huge personal sacrifices for the benefit of others, and costly altruism, where people are willing to pay a personal price to punish those who break the rules.
And the main takeaway here is that altruism in some form is actually a key driver for people who carry out suicide attacks. That seems so counterintuitive given the level of violence involved.
I know it's a really hard concept to wrap your head around, but it's a widely accepted view among scholars who study this stuff. They argue that these individuals are driven by a sense of altruism, but it's a tragically misdirected altruism, operating within a very specific and often distorted moral framework. They truly believe they're acting for the greater good of their group or cause, even if it means killing innocent people.
It's just so disturbing to think that someone could be willing to die for a cause, and that their motivation could be rooted in a desire to help. How do they justify the harm they inflict?
Well, the chapter talks about this idea of in-group morality versus out-group amorality. It's like they dehumanize the people they're targeting, seeing them as a threat to their own group. Within that framework, they believe they're acting morally, even righteously, to defend their group.
Chilling stuff. And then chapter 16 takes this idea further, examining pathological altruism and pathological obedience in the context of genocide, specifically the Rwandan genocide.
Right. They basically argue that genocide can be understood as this combination of pathological altruism at the top, the leaders who manipulate and exploit people's altruistic tendencies for their own political goals, and pathological obedience among the followers, who are basically just following orders, even though those orders are horrific.
So it's like the leaders convince people they're doing something good for their group, and then the followers blindly obey, even though they're participating in mass murder.
Yeah, it's a terrifying example of how easily people can be manipulated into doing terrible things when they believe they're acting in the service of some higher cause. And what's really striking is that a lot of these followers are ordinary people. They're not necessarily psychopaths or sociopaths. They just get swept up in this wave of groupthink and obedience.
It's a scary thought, isn't it, that anyone, even someone who seems perfectly normal, could be capable of such atrocities under the right circumstances. Chapter 17 shifts gears a bit and looks at foreign aid. Do our good intentions really help? So we're moving from genocide to something that seems a lot more positive on the surface.
Right, but that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah.
We often assume that foreign aid is this inherently good thing because the intention is to help. But the chapter challenges that assumption and asks whether some forms of foreign aid might actually be doing more harm than good.
So they're saying that even when we're trying to help developing countries, our good intentions could be backfiring.
Exactly. They acknowledge that some aid efforts have been really successful, like things like oral rehydration therapy, education programs in certain countries, and disease eradication efforts. But they also point out that other approaches might be totally ineffective or even harmful in the long run. They even bring up the work of Peter Bauer, this economist who was very skeptical of foreign aid and argued that it often did more to benefit the donors than the recipients.
Right, right. So it's a really complex issue with a lot of different perspectives. And it highlights the need to be really thoughtful and strategic about how we approach foreign aid to make sure it's actually helping the people we're trying to help.
Totally. It's about moving beyond those simplistic assumptions that good intentions automatically equal good outcomes. And that's a theme that runs through this whole book, isn't it?
For sure. Okay, chapter 18 gets really interesting and maybe a little controversial. It asks, was Gandhi a pathological altruist? I mean, Gandhi, the guy who preached nonviolence and led India to independence, that's a bold question.
It is. And it's not meant to diminish Gandhi's accomplishments or his moral stature. But it does raise this really thought-provoking question about whether his extreme levels of self-sacrifice and his unwavering commitment to nonviolence, even when it came at a huge personal cost, could be seen as a form of pathological altruism.
So they're basically questioning whether his unwavering dedication to his principles, even when it caused him and others to suffer, might have crossed a line.
Right. They highlight Gandhi's belief that violence should always be minimized, even though he acknowledged that it might be unavoidable in some situations. And he also expanded the idea of nonviolence beyond just physical harm. He talked about passive violence, which includes things like hurting others emotionally or indirectly. But the question they raise is, when does this unwavering commitment to a principle, even a seemingly noble one, become potentially harmful?
That's a tough question. Like, when does dedication become obsession? Okay, chapter 19 takes us into the realm of science fiction, or maybe it's more like speculative science. It's titled, What If Extraterrestrials Aren't Altruistic? Implications for SETI. So we're talking about aliens now.
We are. It's a fun thought experiment, but with some serious implications. It basically challenges this assumption that we often make, especially in the West, that any advanced alien civilizations we might encounter through programs like SETI will automatically be benevolent and altruistic towards us.
Yeah, that's like a staple of a lot of science fiction, right? Aliens are either super wise and benevolent, or they're evil invaders.
Right. But the chapter argues that we need to consider a broader range of possibilities. They point out that altruism, as we understand it, is a relatively recent development in human history. For most of our existence, things like reciprocity, like you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, and fairness have been more important drivers of our behavior.
So we shouldn't just assume that aliens will share our current values and morals.
It's exactly. They talk about the potential dangers of assuming extraterrestrial benevolence, especially when it comes to sharing information. Like, what if we send out these messages into space, assuming that any aliens who receive them will be friendly and helpful, and then it turns out they're not? It could be like opening ourselves up to a computer virus or a dangerous meme.
Whoa, that's a scary thought. Okay, back down to Earth for chapter 20, which tackles a big philosophical question. Psychological egoism. Is genuine altruism even possible?
This is the age-old debate, isn't it? Can we ever truly act selflessly, or are we always motivated by some form of self-interest, even if we're not consciously aware of it?
Right, like even when we do something nice for someone else, are we secretly hoping for a reward, even if that reward is just feeling good about ourselves?
Exactly. And the chapter clarifies that when we're talking about altruism, we're really talking about the intention behind the action, not necessarily the outcome. Because even well-intentioned actions can sometimes have negative consequences. And on the flip side, actions that might seem selfish can sometimes have positive, unintended consequences. Like, they use an example from World War II, where some Nazi officials, for their own selfish reasons, kept some Jewish dentists alive, and those dentists ended up surviving the Holocaust because of it.
So intention matters, but psychological egoism argues that our deepest intention is always to serve ourselves in some way.
That's the core argument, and it's a really challenging idea to grapple with because it makes you question the very nature of altruism and human motivation.
It does. Okay, and finally, chapter 21 brings in an evolutionary perspective. It's called Culture-Gene Coevolution of Altruistic Behaviors.
This chapter gets into this really fascinating idea called culture-gene coevolution, which basically says that our behavior, including things like altruism, isn't just determined by our genes or just by our culture. It's shaped by this ongoing dynamic interplay between the two.
So our genes might predispose us to certain behaviors, but then our culture can either reinforce or suppress those predispositions.
Right. And even more than that, cultural practices that are really beneficial for a group, like those that increase survival or reproductive success, can actually influence which genes get passed on to future generations. So culture can actually shape the evolution of our genes.
And they use a really cool example to illustrate this, right? The whole milk drinking thing.
Yeah, that's a classic example of culture-gene coevolution. Cultures that developed cattle herding also developed the practice of drinking milk. And over time, this created a selective pressure favoring people who had the genes to digest lactose as adults because they had access to this new food source. So the cultural practice of drinking milk actually influenced the evolution of our genes. And the chapter argues that altruistic behaviors might also be subject to this kind of coevolutionary process, which could help explain why we see different levels and types of altruism in different cultures.
So it's not just that some cultures are more altruistic than others, it's that altruism itself has evolved differently in different environments.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this really important point. Altruism is complicated. It's not just this simple, straightforward good thing. It can be influenced by all sorts of factors, from our individual psychology to our cultural background to our evolutionary history.
And this whole deep dive into pathological altruism, especially the chapters we focused on today, has really driven that point home. It's given us a lot to think about, hasn't it?
It has. And hopefully it's encouraged our listeners to be a bit more critical and nuanced in their thinking about altruism, to question those simple assumptions and to consider the potential for both positive and negative consequences, even when our intentions are good.
Absolutely. Because as we've seen, even the best intentions can sometimes lead to unintended and even harmful outcomes. And being aware of those possibilities can help us be more effective and compassionate in our efforts to help others.
It's about being mindful, being aware, and being willing to challenge our own assumptions.
Great stuff. Well, that's another deep dive done. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
All right, welcome back for another deep dive. We've been exploring this idea of pathological altruism
We have.
and kind of picking it apart from different angles. And so for those of you who have been with us, we've been working our way through the book Pathological Altruism, and we're on to part 4 now. This is where things get, I think, even more interesting.
Yeah, it's where we start to expand the view a little bit. So part 4 is called Cultural and Evolutionary Dimensions, which is where we move beyond the individual. We've been talking a lot about individual psychology, individual motivations, individual pathologies even.
Right.
But this is where we zoom out and start to look at society level influences and even, go all the way back and look at evolutionary influences.
Yeah. So, for you, our listeners, who we always think of as the learner, you want to know more. You want to kind of understand these things at a deeper level. And that's what you're aiming to do in these deep dives. We're going to be looking at chapters 22 through 24 today. And, we're going to be exploring how these larger forces, cultural and evolutionary, can really shape our understanding of altruism.
Yeah.
And where it can sometimes go wrong.
Yeah, sometimes in kind of unexpected and surprising ways.
Absolutely. So, okay, with that, let's just jump right in. Chapter
Excellent.
22. The title of the chapter is Culture-Gene Coevolution.
Right. So this is a really, really important concept because for a long time people have been debating, is it nature or is it nurture?
Yeah.
Are we the products of our genes or are we the products of our environment? This chapter, The Theory of Culture-Gene Coevolution, says it's both. But it says it's both in a really, really interesting way. It's not just that, oh yeah, genes and environment both play a role. It's that there's this dynamic interplay between the two. So the idea is that cultural traits, like, specific practices or beliefs can themselves be adaptive and they can evolve over time. And they can also influence the environment in ways that then affect how genes are selected for or against. So it's this back and forth, this coevolutionary process between genes and culture.
So it's not just that our environment shapes us, we're also shaping our environment, and that's changing kind of the pressures on our genes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's not a one-way street. It's this really, really dynamic and interactive process.
So can you give us an example of that, like in action?
Yeah, sure. So one of the classic examples of culture-gene coevolution is the evolution of lactose tolerance in humans,
Okay.
alongside the domestication of cattle. So, way, way back when our ancestors started domesticating cattle, right? And started using them for milk. Well, being able to digest milk as an adult is actually a pretty unique trait. Most mammals, they lose the ability to digest lactose after they're weaned.
Wow.
But in cultures that started raising cattle for milk, suddenly there was this big advantage to being able to digest lactose as an adult because you had this whole new source of nutrition.
Right.
So what happened is the cultural practice of raising cattle for milk actually created an environment where individuals who had genes that allowed them to digest lactose as adults were more likely to survive and reproduce
Got it.
and pass those genes on. So we see this really clear example of how a cultural practice, the practice of dairy farming, actually drove a genetic adaptation, the evolution of lactose tolerance.
So this is just like drinking milk changes your genes kind of thing.
Well, not quite. It's not that the act of drinking milk changes your genes. It's that the cultural practice of drinking milk changes the environment in a way that favors certain genes. So individuals who already have those genes, they're going to be more likely to thrive in that environment, and they're going to be more likely to have offspring who also inherit those genes. So it's like the cultural practice sets the stage for natural selection to do its work.
I got it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So it's like having the gene is one thing, but then the culture actually makes it an advantage.
Exactly. Yeah. The
Yeah.
culture creates the selection pressure.
Okay. So how does this idea, this culture gene coevolution,
Huh?
how does that then apply to altruism?
Well, if we think about altruism, helping behaviors,
Yeah.
things like that,
Yeah.
we can see how cultural norms and practices around helping others might have created an environment where individuals who were genetically predisposed to be more altruistic, more helpful, more cooperative,
Mm-hmm.
those individuals might have been more successful
Okay.
because they were more likely to be part of groups that did well. You
Yeah.
know, they were more likely to be part of groups that were successful in whatever their particular environment was.
Right, right. So in a way, those cultural practices could have actually selected for genes that promoted altruistic behavior.
Got it. Okay.
So, it's kind of like the dairy farming example, but instead of dairy farming, it's like, cooperative hunting
Mm.
or sharing resources or, things like that.
Right, right. So the culture itself is kind of like breeding for those traits
Yeah.
or helping those traits to spread.
Exactly. Yeah. And then on the flip side, you can also imagine that, if you have individuals who are genetically predisposed to be more cooperative, more helpful, that might make it easier for them to develop cultural norms that emphasize altruism.
Okay.
So it can go both ways. Genes can influence culture and culture can influence genes. And this is happening over long periods of time.
So it's a feedback loop.
It is. It's a feedback loop. Yeah.
So the book also talks about how cultural transmission is much faster than genetic evolution. So how does that play into all this?
Yeah, so cultural transmission, that's just a fancy way of saying, how we learn and pass on information and practices.
Hmm.
And that can happen much more quickly than genetic changes. Like, think about how quickly, new ideas can spread through a population today
Right, right.
with the internet and everything.
Yeah.
So culture can adapt to new challenges, to new opportunities much more rapidly than genes can.
Okay.
And so that means that culture can actually be a really important driver of adaptation. It can allow groups to adapt to changes in their environment much faster than they could if they were relying on genetic changes alone.
So, for you, our listener, think about how this plays out in the real world. Like, think about how different cultures have different norms around altruism.
Yeah. Yeah.
What might be considered, a normal act of kindness in one culture might be seen as excessive or even harmful in another culture.
Yeah.
And this is where we start to see how this idea of pathological altruism can really come into play.
Right, because those cultural values, they shape our understanding of what's appropriate, what's, praiseworthy even. And so what might be seen as, a virtuous act of self-sacrifice in one culture might be seen as, enabling negative behavior in another culture.
Right.
And that's, I think, what makes this whole discussion so interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 23. Now, this is a really interesting chapter. It's called The Messianic Effect of Pathological Altruism. That sounds almost biblical in a way.
It does. It does have that, that kind of grandiose feel to it.
Right.
And what this chapter does is it uses the framework of game theory, specifically the prisoner's dilemma, to explore how the presence of even a small number of individuals who exhibit what they call pathological altruism can really change the dynamics of cooperation within a group.
Okay, so first of all, for those who might not be familiar, can you just kind of briefly explain the prisoner's dilemma?
Yeah, sure. So the prisoner's dilemma is this classic scenario in game theory. And the basic setup is you have two individuals who have been arrested for a crime, and they're being interrogated separately. And each individual has a choice. They can either cooperate with the other person, which basically means staying silent, or they can defect, which means betraying the other person.
Okay.
And the way the payoffs are structured, it's always in your best interest to defect no matter what the other person does.
So even if you know the other person is going to stay silent, you should still betray them.
Yeah, because if the other person stays silent and you betray them, you get to go free.
Okay.
But if you both stay silent, you both get a lighter sentence. And if you both betray each other, you both get a heavier sentence. So it's like no matter what the other person does, you're always better off betraying them.
So it's like rational self-interest leads to a worse outcome for both of you.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the dilemma.
Okay. So now where do these so-called pathological altruists fit into all this?
So in this model, a pathological altruist, or a PA, is someone who always cooperates.
Always.
Always. Regardless of what the other person does. They don't care about the payoffs. They
Yeah.
don't care if they're going to get a worse outcome for themselves. They always choose to cooperate.
That doesn't seem very rational.
It doesn't. And that's why it's called pathological altruism, right?
Yeah.
It's this idea that they're so altruistic that it's actually hurting them.
Okay.
But what's really interesting is that even a small number of these PAs can have a huge impact on the overall level of cooperation in a group.
So, like, how does that work?
Well, the book talks about this thing called the messianic effect. And it's called that because it's like these PAs are, they're almost like saviors. They come in and they change everything. So there's this figure in the book, figure 23.2, that shows how the level of cooperation in a population changes as you increase the number of PAs.
Okay.
And what you see is that when there are no PAs, cooperation is really low. Everyone's just betraying each other.
Right.
But then, as soon as you start adding in even a small number of PAs, cooperation starts to increase dramatically.
Like, how small a number?
Like even 1 or 2 PAs can make a big difference.
Wow.
And the more PAs you add, the higher the level of cooperation goes.
So it's like their presence is contagious in a way.
Yeah, it's like they're infecting the population with cooperation.
Okay, so why does that happen? Like, why does having these irrationally altruistic people around, why does that make everyone else more cooperative?
So one way to think about it is that the PAs are essentially changing the game.
Okay.
So remember how we said that in the classic prisoner's dilemma, it's always in your best interest to defect? Well, when you have PAs around, it's not always in your best interest to defect anymore.
Because you know they're going to cooperate.
Right. Because if you defect against a PA, you're going to get a worse outcome than if you cooperate with them.
Okay.
So suddenly, cooperation becomes a more viable strategy. And the more PAs there are, the more viable cooperation becomes.
So it's like they're tilting the scales towards cooperation.
Exactly. Yeah. They're tilting the scales. And what's really interesting is that this effect is pretty robust. Like, it doesn't really matter how big the cost of cooperating is.
Right.
Even if it's really costly to cooperate, the PAs can still have this effect.
So even if you know you're going to get hurt by cooperating, you're still more likely to do it if there are enough PAs around.
Yeah, because you know that if you defect, you're going to get hurt even more.
Wow.
So it's like they're creating this environment where cooperation is the best strategy, even if it's not the most rational strategy from a purely self-interested perspective.
So, for you, our listener, think about how this might play out in the real world. Like, think about social movements or charities or any kind of group effort where people are working together for a common goal. Often these efforts are driven by a small number of really dedicated people who are willing to put in a lot of time and energy and even personal sacrifice for the cause. And some people might look at them and think, oh, they're crazy, they're doing all this work and they're not even getting anything out of it. But what this chapter suggests is that those people, those really dedicated people, they might actually be the key to the whole thing working.
Yeah. They might be the ones who are creating the environment where cooperation is possible, where people are willing to put in the effort because they know that others are doing the same.
Right, right. So even if their altruism seems a little bit extreme, it might actually be what's making the whole thing work.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that's a really powerful insight.
It is. But the chapter also talks about how this messianic effect can have a dark side too.
Yeah, it does. And this is something to think about, right? Because if you have a group of people who are really dedicated to a cause and that cause is harmful, then this messianic effect could actually make things worse.
So, like a cult, for example.
Yeah, a cult is a good example. Or a terrorist group, or any kind of group where the goal is to harm others.
Right.
If you have a few really dedicated people in that group who are willing to do whatever it takes to achieve the goal, then their presence could actually make it easier for other people to go along with it.
Because they're creating that environment of cooperation or commitment.
Exactly, yeah. And so I think that's a really important caveat to keep in mind.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so let's move on to our final chapter for today, chapter 24. And this is a really, controversial chapter. Maybe.
It is. And we want to be really careful here.
Yes.
Because the title of the chapter is Battered Women, Happy Genes.
Yeah.
And that title alone can be really triggering for some people.
Absolutely.
So we want to be very clear that we are not in any way condoning or excusing domestic violence. But what this chapter does is it looks at the evolutionary logic behind why some women might stay in abusive relationships.
Okay. So how does evolution explain that?
Well, the chapter starts by looking at this figure figure 24.1. And what that figure shows is that women who have experienced abuse from their husbands tend to have more sons than women who haven't.
Okay.
And that's kind of a surprising finding.
It is.
But the chapter argues that this actually makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay.
Because, and again, this is not to say that this is right or good or anything like that.
No.
But from a purely evolutionary perspective,
Yeah.
if you're a woman and you want to pass on your genes, then having sons who are going to be successful in attracting mates is a good way to do that.
Okay.
And unfortunately, men who are aggressive, who are violent, they tend to be more successful in attracting mates.
So even though it's harmful to the woman, it might be beneficial to her genes.
Right. And again, we have to be really careful here because, we're not talking about individual women making conscious decisions to stay in abusive relationships because they want to have more sons. What we're talking about are these deep evolutionary pressures that might be influencing behavior in ways that we're not even aware of.
So it's like, it's not a conscious choice, but it's something that's kind of built into our biology.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the chapter also talks about the fact that, if you're a woman and you already have children, it can be really difficult to find a new partner who's going to be a good father to your children.
Right.
Especially if your children are not biologically his.
Yeah.
And so staying with an abusive partner, even though it's harmful to you, might actually be the best way to protect your children.
So it's like, it's a trade-off between, your own well-being and the well-being of your children.
Right. And again, this is not to say that this is a good trade-off or that women should stay in abusive relationships.
No, absolutely not.
But it's to say that there might be these deep evolutionary pressures that are making it more difficult for women to leave.
Right. And so this chapter, it really forces us to confront this idea that, what's good for our genes is not always what's good for us as individuals.
Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, one of the main takeaways from this whole book.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground today. For you, our listener, we've talked about how culture and genes interact to shape our understanding of altruism, and how even a small number of extremely altruistic individuals can have a huge impact on group behavior. And we've talked about the potential evolutionary logic behind why some women might stay in abusive relationships.
And I think one of the things that I'm really struck by is just how complex all of this is. We tend to think of altruism as this simple good thing, but the reality is it's much more complicated than that. And I think understanding these cultural and evolutionary dimensions is really important if we want to understand how altruism works in the real world.
Absolutely. And so, for you, our listener, we'll leave you with this thought. How might understanding these deeper forces that we've been talking about, how might that inform our approaches to addressing, the harmful forms of altruism that we see in the world? Or, another way to think about it is, how do these insights challenge our assumptions about what altruism is and whether it's always a good thing?
Yeah, those are big questions. And I don't think there are any easy answers, but I think they're important questions to ask.
Absolutely. So we encourage you to keep thinking about these things and to, check out the book Pathological Altruism if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks for listening. All right, so we're back and ready to kind of dive back into this whole idea of pathological altruism. It's one of those things that keeps coming up, right? Like, how can good intentions, doing things for others, somehow end up causing harm?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like, you want to be a good person, you want to help, but then things go sideways. And that's what's so fascinating about this deep dive into pathological altruism, specifically this part V. It really gets into the nuts and bolts of how this whole thing develops.
Yeah, chapters 25 through 28, right? We're going beyond just defining what it is now. We're looking under the hood, so to speak. Like, what's going on in the brain? What are the mechanisms that can make these well-meaning actions take such a wrong turn?
Exactly. And we're trying to unpack that. Because these chapters, they highlight these really interesting connections between things we usually think of as good, like empathy, right? Feeling for others, or even just a sense of responsibility, and how these things, these positive traits, can get tangled up with, like, our brain chemistry, our hormones, and end up producing these surprisingly negative results.
It's like we're taking apart a clock to see what makes it tick, but this clock, it's kind of messed up, right? It tells the wrong time sometimes, even though all the parts are there.
That's a great analogy, and that's really what we're trying to do here. We're looking at those individual parts, the psychology, the neurology, the social factors, to see how they come together to create this phenomenon of altruism gone wrong.
Yeah.
And you've brought some fantastic material to the table today, really digging into those real world examples of how this plays out.
Yeah, I mean, these chapters are dense. But let's start with chapter 25. It really jumps into this potential connection between feeling things really deeply, that heightened empathy, right, and also that feeling of guilt. And it links those things to problems that seem to be more common in women, like anxiety and mood disorders. What stood out to you from this chapter?
Well, one of the first things that really grabbed my attention was how the chapter breaks down empathy into two distinct processes, like two sides of the same coin happening in the brain. There's what they call affective empathy. So that's like that gut level feeling, the immediate emotional response you have when you see someone else feeling something. Like if you see someone crying, you might feel a twinge of sadness yourself, almost automatically.
Right, like you're kind of catching their emotion, almost like a cold.
Exactly. It's that direct emotional resonance. And then there's cognitive empathy, sometimes referred to as theory of mind. And that's more about the mental process of understanding why someone is feeling the way they are, putting yourself in their shoes, imagining what they might be thinking or going through.
So it's not just feeling with them, it's understanding their perspective, right? Like piecing together the reasons behind their emotions.
Precisely. And then the chapter introduces this really intriguing theory called the empathizing systemizing theory. And it basically suggests that people tend to lean more towards one or the other. Like some folks are naturally more drawn to understanding emotions, social cues, that's the empathizing part, while others are more interested in like systems, rules, patterns, that's the systemizing part. And the theory posits that generally speaking, females tend to be a bit stronger on the empathizing side, while males lean through systemizing.
Interesting. So it's not like everyone fits neatly into one box or the other, but it's more like a spectrum, right?
Yeah.
With people tending to gravitate towards one end or the other. And how does this like fetal testosterone stuff fit into all of this?
Well, the chapter dives into research suggesting that lower levels of fetal testosterone exposure in the womb seem to be linked to higher levels of empathy later in life. And this applies to both sexes. And then, when we look at hormones in adults, things like oxytocin and vasopressin, they seem to play a part in both empathy and altruistic behaviors. And there are some hints, some intriguing suggestions that these might function a little differently in men and women. So it's like there might be these basic biological factors, setting the stage for our capacity for empathy right from the start.
Okay, so it's not just about like how we're raised or what society expects from us. There could be these like underlying biological nudges kind of pointing us in one direction or the other. That's pretty fascinating.
Absolutely. And this chapter draws this really thought-provoking parallel. Just like how a slower developmental pace in some boys might be linked to difficulties with impulse control, perhaps an earlier social and emotional maturity in some girls might be connected to this heightened sensitivity to others' feelings. It's like the empathy dial is set a bit higher from the get-go, maybe.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. Like different developmental trajectories could contribute to these differences in empathy. Okay, so the chapter then shifts gears a bit and talks about this cognitive attributional theory. What were your takeaways from that part?
Well, for me, what really resonated was this idea of how kids, especially when they're growing up with a caregiver who is struggling, how they learn to make sense of responsibility and their own sense of helplessness. Like, imagine a child trying to help a parent who's dealing with depression. They try and try, but they can't fix it. It's heartbreaking, right? And the chapter suggests that this kind of experience can create this really confusing mix of feeling responsible, but also completely powerless.
Right, that constant tension between wanting to help and feeling unable to actually make things better.
Exactly. And the chapter proposes that this can then lead to like these negative self-views and a tendency to take on way too much responsibility for other people's problems later in life. Because they never really learn to separate what they can control from what they can't. Yeah. And that inability to set healthy boundaries can become a real issue.
Right, it's like they're always trying to fix things, even when it's not their responsibility or even within their power to fix. And the chapter says that girls might be especially susceptible to this, especially if they have a parent who's struggling with depression, which then leads to this idea of silencing the self, right?
Yes. That was a powerful concept. The chapter suggests that these early experiences, constantly trying to meet the needs of a distressed caregiver, can basically teach a child to suppress their own needs and desires, to silence the self as a way to like maintain connection and avoid feeling guilty or like they're causing more problems. And this learned pattern, putting others first, always, it can become so deeply ingrained that it impacts how they relate to everyone as adults, often leading to, this overdeveloped sense of empathy-based guilt, always feeling responsible even when they're not.
And this is where that dispositional altruism scale, the DAW, comes in, right?
Yeah,
Helping researchers understand this whole empathy-guilt connection.
exactly. The DOS is this tool that researchers use to study these connections between empathy, guilt, and how those relate to these tendencies towards pathological altruism. And the chapter emphasizes this important point. Like, feeling guilty when you've genuinely messed up, that's normal, right? It's a social regulator, keeps us in check. But empathy-based guilt, that becomes a problem when it starts to distort our thinking about cause and effect in our relationships. We start feeling responsible for things that are totally outside our control.
So it's not just feeling bad, it's feeling bad and then acting on that in ways that aren't helpful or even harmful because our sense of responsibility is so out of whack.
Exactly. It's that disconnect between feeling responsible and what's actually going on. And that seems to be a key piece in the puzzle of how altruism can go wrong.
Okay, so chapter 25 lays out this foundation of like potentially heightened empathy guilt, particularly in women, maybe stemming from those early life experiences. Then chapter 26 takes us into this concept of the hyperempathic brain. What's the gist of that?
So chapter 26 zooms in on individuals who, for different reasons, might struggle with that systemizing part. We talked about analyzing systems, patterns, but they have this really powerful, sometimes overwhelming drive to empathize. They're like super empathizers.
And this all goes back to that empathizing, systemizing theory, right? Like different ends of the spectrum.
Exactly. The theory suggests that these two things are kind of opposite ends of a personality dimension. So while someone with autism might be incredibly strong in systemizing, but have challenges with empathy, the hyper-empathizer is flipped. Really high on the empathy, maybe lower on the systemizing. And what's interesting is the chapter points out that these hyper-empathizers might fly under the radar, clinically speaking.
Like they might not be diagnosed with any specific disorder because on the surface, being super empathic seems like a good thing, right?
Right. It's seen as a positive trait. But their struggles might not present in the typical ways we think about mental health challenges. Even though their intense emotional responses and difficulty setting boundaries could be causing them a lot of personal distress, or even leading them into situations where their altruistic tendencies end up hurting them or others.
So it's like their empathy is almost too much to handle and it can backfire. So what does the chapter tell us about the actual brain stuff going on behind this intense capacity for empathy?
Well, it really gets into the nitty-gritty. Starts with this idea of emotional contagion, which is kind of like, when you yawn and someone else yawns. It's that automatic, almost unconscious mirroring of emotions. Like if you see someone smile, you might feel a little lift yourself. The chapter explains that simply observing someone else's emotional state can actually activate similar areas in your own brain.
That makes sense. Like our brains are wired to kind of resonate with each other's emotions.
Yeah, it's like a built-in empathy response. Then there's this simulation theory of empathy, which proposes that we understand other people's feelings by internally simulating their mental state in our own minds. Like we're trying on their feelings and thoughts to understand them.
And those mirror neurons, the ones that fire both when we do something and when we see someone else do it, they play a role in this, right?
Exactly. Mirror neurons are thought to be a key part of this simulation process. They help us make sense of other people's actions and intentions by activating those same neural pathways in our own brains, as if we were doing the action ourselves, like we're experiencing it vicariously through our neurons.
That's so cool. And the chapter revisits that distinction between affective and cognitive empathy, but this time focusing on the actual networks in the brain involved in each.
Right. Both types of empathy are important, but they engage different, although overlapping, neural networks. Affective empathy, that emotional resonance, it's more linked to brain areas involved in processing emotions, like the limbic system. While cognitive empathy, understanding someone's perspective, involves areas related to, mentalizing, thinking about other people's thoughts, with the prefrontal cortex.
So, like different parts of the brain working together to create the full picture of empathy. What are some of the specific brain areas that the chapter highlights?
Well, there are a few key players. The insula, for example, it's involved in our awareness of our own internal bodily states and also plays a role in processing emotions. Then there's the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC, which is involved in things like detecting conflict and processing emotional pain. And then the somatosensory cortex, which is all about physical sensations and is thought to be involved in understanding other people's physical states like discomfort or pain. And of course, the prefrontal cortex, that's the CEO of the brain, involved in regulating our emotions and making social judgments. So it's this whole team of brain regions working together.
Wow, it's complicated. And there's that interesting bit about how cultural differences can actually show up in brain activity related to altruism.
Yeah, that was a really fascinating finding. The chapter talks about the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is a region associated with altruistic behavior. And studies have shown that activity in this region is linked to increased altruism and empathy in some cultures, like American participants, but not necessarily in others, like Korean participants in one study. So it's like cultural values might actually shape how our brains express altruism.
That's mind-blowing. Like, our culture is actually shaping our brain activity. The chapter also talks about dehumanization and how that impacts our empathy towards others.
That's a really crucial point. There's research showing that when we view members of what the chapter calls extreme outgroups, like the example they use is disgusting homeless people, there's less activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, an area usually involved in thinking about other people's minds. So it's like when we dehumanize someone, we're basically turning down the volume on our brain's capacity for empathy towards them.
That's pretty disturbing, but it explains a lot about how people can treat each other so poorly, right? What about like our ability to consciously control our empathy or even shut it off completely?
Yeah, that's an important point. The chapter mentions that the prefrontal cortex, that executive control center of the brain, it can actually exert top-down control over our empathy response. Like we can, to some extent, modulate or even suppress our feelings of empathy, especially towards someone else's pain. And that's probably a good thing in some situations, right? Like if you're a surgeon, you need to be able to focus on the task at hand without being overwhelmed by the patient's suffering.
Makes sense. It's like a self-preservation mechanism too, maybe. So we don't get totally burnt out by other people's pain. And then the chapter comes back to those hormones, oxytocin and vasopressin, in the context of this hypoempathic brain.
Right. As we talked about before, these hormones are really important for social behavior. Oxytocin, it tends to decrease activity in the amygdala, which is that fear and emotion center of the brain. And it promotes social bonding and trust. Vasopressin, on the other hand, is more involved in things like stress response and social regulation. And the chapter points out that there might be individual differences in the genes that code for these hormones receptors. And that can explain why some people are naturally more empathetic than others.
So it's like this whole complex cocktail of brain regions, hormones, genes, and even our culture all mixing together to shape our capacity for empathy and how we express it.
Exactly. It's this incredible interplay of factors. And understanding these underlying mechanisms, that's absolutely key to understanding how this incredible power of empathy can sometimes get amplified or even misdirected in ways that lead to pathological altruism.
Okay, so chapter 27, things get even broader, and we start looking at whether empathy and altruism even extend beyond humans to animals, which raises some really big ethical and evolutionary questions, right?
Well, absolutely. The chapter starts by acknowledging this long-standing debate in philosophy and ethics about the moral status of animals. Like, do they have the same rights as humans? Should our circle of concern include them? And it also points out this kind of uncomfortable truth, even within the human race, we don't always show the same level of concern for everyone, especially those we might not consider persons.
That's a really good point. Like, that concept of personhood seems to be a big factor in where our empathy flows most easily.
It does. And then the chapter presents some pretty compelling evidence that we might not be the only species capable of empathy. It talks about things like contagious yawning in dogs, where one dog yawns and then others start yawning too. And cases of chimpanzees adopting orphan chimps who aren't even related to them. Those suggest some level of responding to the distress of others.
Yeah, that's pretty remarkable. So, what does the chapter say about the evolutionary roots of empathy when we look beyond just humans?
Well, it highlights this crucial role of parental care in the evolution of empathy, especially in mammals, like that strong bond between a parent and their offspring and the need to be super responsive to their needs. That probably laid the groundwork for more general empathic abilities.
Okay.
But the chapter also points out that from a purely evolutionary perspective, focusing on, survival of the fittest and passing on our genes, there's not really a huge benefit to helping those who aren't directly related to us. And that leads to the definition of true altruism, helping others without any expectation of personal gain.
Which brings us right back to that puzzle of pathological altruism. Like, how can these seemingly selfless acts end up being harmful? The chapter also touches on how the very concept of altruism can vary between cultures, using those Japanese terms as an example.
Yeah, that was a fascinating point. It talks about the Japanese words eitoshugi, which is kind of like consideration for others, and ritoshugi, which is closer to our Western idea of unselfish behavior or altruism. But what's interesting is that when you look at ritoshugi in Japanese dictionaries that aren't specifically made for English speakers, it doesn't always have that same strong implication of self-sacrifice that we usually associate with the word altruism in English.
So it's like even something as seemingly straightforward as altruism, the way we define it, it can be influenced by our cultural background. And then the chapter brings in this theory of culture-gene coevolution. How does that help explain these pro-social tendencies?
So this theory basically proposes that our genes and our culture, they're not totally separate things. They're constantly interacting and influencing each other over time. So cultural practices that are beneficial for survival and reproduction, they can create an environment where certain genes become more advantageous, and then those genes can make those cultural practices even more likely to continue. It's like a feedback loop. A classic example is the coevolution of genes that let adults digest milk and the cultural practice of raising cattle for milk.
So our biology and our learned behaviors, they're constantly shaping each other over generations. That's incredible.
It is. And the chapter suggests that our pre-social tendencies, empathy, altruism, all that, have probably been shaped by this kind of coevolutionary process.
Hmm.
It also brings up this concept of toxic memes, like the idea that certain ideas or beliefs can be harmful and spread through a culture. And it contrasts this with the more modern Western view, where we tend to shy away from labeling ideas as inherently dangerous.
Yeah, that's a really interesting distinction. How does that connect to SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence?
Well, the chapter argues that our current Western cultural assumptions, which might include this kind of optimistic view that all advanced civilizations would naturally be altruistic, that this could be influencing our expectations about finding intelligent life out there. Given that historical perspective on toxic memes and the potential for good intentions to have really bad consequences, it might be a little naive to assume that all highly developed alien societies will automatically be friendly and benevolent.
So instead of just assuming they'll be all generous and helpful, what's a more realistic approach to potential interactions with other civilizations?
The chapter proposes this be fair principle as a more grounded foundation for interactions, both between humans and potentially with extraterrestrial life. Like the idea of reciprocity and mutual benefit might be a more reliable starting point than just hoping for pure altruism.
Okay, so be fair, not necessarily be generous, right?
Exactly. And finally, chapter 27 touches on this concept of psychological egoism. The idea that all of our actions, even the seemingly selfless ones, are ultimately motivated by self-interest. How does the chapter reconcile that with altruism? Well, the chapter emphasizes that regardless of whether psychological egoism is actually true, altruism is defined by the intention behind the action, not just the outcome. Someone can act with a genuine desire to help others, but their actions might fail or even cause harm because of unforeseen circumstances or, just plain incompetence. And conversely, someone might act out of pure self-interest, but their actions could end up benefiting others unintentionally. The key difference is that primary motivation.
So even if there's a little bit of self-interest baked into everything we do, it's that conscious intention to benefit others that defines altruism, whether it ends up being healthy or pathological.
Exactly. And that brings us to the last chapter in this section, chapter 28, which delves into empathic distress fatigue, the potential downside of caring too much.
That sounds like something a lot of people, especially those in helping professions or caregivers, can relate to. What exactly is empathic distress fatigue?
The chapter describes it as this potential negative consequence for people who are constantly exposed to the suffering of others. And while it sometimes gets confused with compassion fatigue, the chapter highlights a key difference. It's not just the practical demands of caregiving, it's the perceived suffering of others that seems to be a major predictor of depressive symptoms in caregivers.
So it's not just the workload, it's the emotional burden of witnessing that pain.
Right. And then the chapter carefully distinguishes empathy, which is that feeling with someone, sharing their emotional state, from other related concepts like compassion, empathic concern, and sympathy, which are more about feeling for someone without necessarily mirroring their exact feelings. It's a subtle but important distinction.
So how do those different emotional responses relate to our tendency to help or to withdraw from others who are suffering?
Well, compassion, sympathy, and empathic concern, they tend to be more other-oriented and often lead to pro-social behavior, like wanting to help alleviate someone's suffering. But pure empathy, sometimes it can lead to what's called empathic distress or personal distress, which is this more self-focused response characterized by feelings of discomfort and anxiety in the observer. And this self-oriented distress, it can often lead to withdrawing from the situation as a way to protect yourself from those negative emotions.
So it's like feeling someone else's pain too intensely can actually make us want to pull away from them, even if they need our help. That seems counterintuitive.
It is a bit of a paradox.
Yeah.
But the chapter mentions fMRI studies showing that when people adopt a self-perspective while watching someone else suffer, there's more activity in those brain regions associated with threat and pain processing like the amygdala. So like over-identifying with someone else's suffering can overload your system and trigger this self-protective withdrawal response, even if it means not helping.
The chapter does point out that this withdrawal response might actually be adaptive in certain situations, like a way to avoid burnout.
Exactly. Especially for people who are chronically exposed to intense suffering, like professional caregivers. That kind of emotional distancing can be a crucial safeguard against burnout, which can have serious consequences for their mental and physical health. So it's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between empathy and self-preservation.
Right, because we can't pour from an empty cup, so to speak. And finally, chapter 28 comes back to this idea of how the label of pathological altruism can be relative depending on whose perspective we're looking from.
Yes, that's a really important point. The chapter highlights that what might seem like pathological altruism from the perspective of the person on the receiving end, the one being harmed by these well-meaning but misguided actions, it could be seen as totally normal, even admirable from the perspective of the person doing the sacrificing. And they're in-group, too, like think of suicide bombers. A horrific act from the outside, but within their own group, it's seen as the ultimate sacrifice, driven by loyalty to their ideology. This connects to the idea of parochial altruism, where altruism is mainly directed toward your own group, sometimes at the expense of others. And that can actually be evolutionarily advantageous in situations of intergroup competition.
Like it's a survival strategy, but taken to a really extreme and harmful level. And this can escalate into what the chapter calls runaway altruism, right?
Exactly. When you combine strong in-group favoritism with a lack of self-awareness or even self-deception, things can get really dangerous. This runaway altruism can manifest in things like sports hooliganism, gang violence, and in the most extreme cases, genocide. Individuals lose their sense of individuality, becoming totally consumed by the group's goals, and that's often coupled with denying personal responsibility, a kind of moral amnesia, and dehumanizing the outgroup, making extreme violence seem justified in service of the in-group's supposed well-being.
So it's like this sobering reminder that even this seemingly positive drive to help, it can be distorted and amplified in these incredibly dangerous ways through all these complex psychological and social dynamics.
Absolutely. These chapters really drive home the point that pathological altruism isn't just about being too nice or giving too much. It's a much more complex and often disturbing interplay of our emotions, our brain chemistry, our early experiences, our social context, and even some of our deeply ingrained evolutionary tendencies.
All right, so wrapping up our deep dive into these chapters, we've really explored these fascinating connections between empathy, guilt, and the brain processes that contribute to altruistic behavior and how those can go astray. We've seen that even empathy, a seemingly positive trait, can have a darker side when it's amplified, misdirected, or mixed with things like in-group bias and a lack of self-awareness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've looked at how our early experiences and how we learn to attribute responsibility can shape our sense of guilt and lead to unhealthy altruistic patterns. We've delved into the brain mechanisms behind empathy, how it can be heightened or suppressed, and we've even considered the implications of extending those altruistic impulses beyond our own species and the very real phenomenon of empathic distress fatigue.
It really shows just how complex human behavior can be. Considering this whole intricate web of emotions, brain chemistry, and social context, it makes you wonder, how can we cultivate altruism that truly benefits others without causing harm? And how can we be more aware of those potential pitfalls, both for ourselves and for the people we're trying to help? It definitely makes you think about your own experiences and the altruistic behaviors you see around you.
It does raise a lot of important questions, and for anyone who wants to explore this topic even further, the book Pathological Altruism is a fantastic resource. It offers such a rich collection of perspectives on this really intriguing aspect of human nature.
Great recommendation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration into the fascinating world of human behavior. All right, so we're back. And, we've been on this deep dive into pathological altruism, and it's been a journey. But today we're hitting this final stretch, right? We're talking part 6 of the book where they try and tie it all together, synthesize everything, and specifically we're going to look at chapters 29 through 31.
Yeah, absolutely. Throughout this whole deep dive, we've been wrestling with all these different perspectives, different ways of looking at this concept of pathological altruism.
Yeah.
And now it's kind of like, okay, how does it all fit together?
Right.
What are the big overarching themes? How do all these pieces connect? And, where do we land? What are the big takeaways as we try to really grapple with this idea that altruism, something we typically think of as being so positive, so beneficial, can actually have this dark side, this pathological side?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, what makes this part of the book, these final chapters, so interesting, right? It's like they're bringing all these different threads together, all these different perspectives, and trying to create this sort of coherent picture. So, let's jump right in. Chapter 29, Hell's Angels, a Runaway Model of Pathological Altruism by Mark Hauser. Okay, that title alone, it's pretty intense. What's Hauser getting at here?
Well, right off the bat, Hauser introduces this idea of a runaway process,
Mhm.
and it's a pretty compelling concept, I think. So
Yeah.
basically, he's suggesting that when you combine this natural human tendency to, favor your own group, your in-group, with this capacity for self-deception, you can set off this chain reaction. It's like this self-perpetuating cycle that can ultimately lead to pathological altruism.
Okay, so self-deception. It's like, I don't, we're not just talking about white lies here. How is Hauser defining self-deception in this context?
Yeah, good point. And so in this context, self-deception, as Hauser describes it, it's like this distortion in our thinking, this kind of cognitive bias. And, what's really fascinating is that he links this cognitive distortion to our evolutionary history. He's suggesting that maybe self-deception persisted because it was intertwined with this very powerful, very primal in-group bias. If you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, prioritizing your own group, your tribe, your kin, that was crucial for survival, right? So over time, maybe this tendency to favor our own, to protect our own, became so deeply ingrained that it actually influenced how we perceive reality. We started to deceive ourselves into believing that our actions, even when harmful to others, were somehow justified because they served the greater good of our group.
Oh, wow. I see. So it's not just that we're, naturally inclined to help our own. It's that we actually convince ourselves that our actions, even when they're harmful to outsiders, are actually the right thing to do. It's like a moral justification fueled by this self-deception.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, Hauser doesn't just leave it at that. He goes on to illustrate this whole runaway process with some pretty striking examples. He talks about sports hooliganism, for instance. Think about that intense loyalty to a team that can lead to violence against rival fans.
Yeah.
Or he talks about street gangs, where an individual's entire identity can become completely subsumed by the gang to the point where they're willing to engage in really harmful, even criminal behavior. And then, of course, he goes on to even more extreme examples, like suicide bombings and genocide. It's all part of this disturbing spectrum.
Wow. Okay, so those are some pretty heavy examples. But I think I'm starting to see the pattern here. It's like in all of these cases, there's this kind of loss of the individual sense of self in favor of the group identity. It's like the individual becomes so absorbed into the group that they lose sight of their own moral compass.
Yeah, exactly. And, Hauser uses this term, moral amnesia, to describe this phenomenon. It's like, because you're so deeply immersed in this collective identity, in the group's beliefs and justifications, you kind of lose touch with your own sense of right and wrong. And then, of course, this makes it much easier to dehumanize those outside the in-group, to see them as the other, as less deserving of empathy or compassion.
Oh, okay. So it's like you're convincing yourself that they are less human, less worthy, and that makes it easier to justify harming them, all in the name of the greater good of us.
Exactly. And what Hauser emphasizes is that this whole process becomes incredibly difficult to break once it gets going. It's like this self-reinforcing cycle.
Hmm.
Because any internal doubts, any feelings of guilt or remorse, any attempts at self-control, they all get kind of overridden by the group's norms, by the group's beliefs. And, he argues that this in-group favoritism, it's a very deep-seated evolutionary drive.
So it's like this primal instinct, this instinct to protect our tribe, our own. And when you combine that with self-deception, it can lead to these really destructive outcomes.
Okay, that's pretty sobering. All right, so let's move on to chapter 30, Altruism Gone Mad by Joachim Kruger. I mean, that title alone tells us we're dealing with some pretty intense stuff here.
Yeah, Kruger really dives into the heart of the paradox here. He starts off by directly addressing this fundamental assumption that many people have, this idea that altruism equals good. It's so deeply ingrained in our thinking and our culture that the very concept of pathological altruism can feel like a contradiction in terms. But Kruger forces us to confront this unsettling truth. The degree of altruism, especially when it's detached from any kind of rational cost-benefit analysis, is what can tip the scales towards pathology.
Yeah, that's the core tension here, isn't it? Like, how can something intended to be good, something motivated by a desire to help others, actually become harmful? How do we reconcile those two things? Right. And Kruger clarifies that the potential for pathology arises when the cost to the altruist is significantly disproportionate to the benefit received by others. So it's not simply about self-sacrifice, which is inherent in many forms of altruism, but when that sacrifice becomes so extreme, so irrational, so detrimental to the altruists themselves, that it raises serious concerns.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about situations where someone might go to extraordinary lengths to help others, even to the point of seriously damaging their own well-being, without a corresponding positive impact on the recipient.
Exactly. You got it. And Kruger makes this important distinction between miscalculation, where maybe someone genuinely believes their efforts will be more beneficial than they actually are, and what he calls potentially pathological motivations. These are the underlying drivers, the deeper psychological forces that might be pushing someone towards this kind of extreme, disproportionate altruism.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about making a mistake, it's about the underlying reasons why someone might be engaging in these behaviors.
Right. And he reminds us that standard morality, conventional thinking about ethics, often places altruism on this very high pedestal. It's seen as this ultimate virtue, both in terms of the intention and the outcome. We're taught from a young age to be selfless, to put others before ourselves.
Yeah, like selflessness is always a good thing, right?
Exactly. But then Kruger kind of shakes things up a bit by introducing this contrasting viewpoint. He references Nietzsche, the philosopher, who had this very critical perspective on altruism. It's a reminder that not everyone throughout history has viewed altruism as an unqualified good. And then he goes on to connect this to ideas from game theory, where even in situations of cooperation, there's this assumption that the benefits to others will outweigh the costs to the self. When that balance gets really skewed, when the costs become excessive and the benefits are minimal, it starts to raise questions of what's really going on.
Yeah, it's like the scales of benefit and cost, they're so out of whack that you have to wonder about the motives behind the altruistic act itself.
Right, exactly. And, Kruger's chapter, it kind of serves as a bridge between all the different perspectives on pathological altruism that we've encountered in this book.
Mhm.
He's pulling all these threads together and forcing us to really confront the complexities of this idea. And, given his own background, his own research on pro-social behavior, it's clear that he's grappling with this question of when this seemingly positive trait, this altruistic impulse, can actually take this dark turn. He's essentially asking us to consider, at what point does altruism cross this invisible line from admirable to mad?
Yeah, that's a really crucial question for us to think about. I mean, so let's move on to our final chapter in this section, chapter 31, Pathology, Evolution, and Altruism by David Sloan Wilson. And it sounds like we're shifting gears a bit here, looking at pathological altruism through this evolutionary lens.
Absolutely. Wilson takes us on this fascinating journey into this idea of a pathological adaptation, which, at first glance might sound like a contradiction in terms, like how can something that evolved to be beneficial also be pathological? But his argument is that traits that were adaptive, that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce in their environments, those same traits can actually become harmful, can become maladaptive over the long term or in different contexts. It's all about the interplay between genes and environment.
Wow, okay, I see what you mean about that being kind of a mind-bending idea. So, like, a trait that might have been beneficial for survival way back when might not be so beneficial in the modern world.
Exactly. Think about our stress response, for example. Like in ancestral environments, when our ancestors were facing immediate threats like predators or rival tribes, this rapid, intense stress reaction, what we call the fight or flight response, that could be life-saving. But in the modern world, where we're constantly bombarded with stressors, but they're often more chronic, less immediate, that same stress response can become overactive. It can lead to anxiety, depression, all sorts of health problems. So, the same biological mechanism that was once essential for survival can actually become pathological in a different environment. And Wilson, he applies this same logic to altruism. He suggests that what might have been beneficial for group survival in the past isn't necessarily beneficial for individuals or even for society as a whole in the present.
Okay, I see. So, altruism, which we generally think of as this positive social trait, might have these evolutionary roots that don't always serve us well in every situation.
Right, you got it. And Wilson goes on to explain that if we define altruism purely in terms of its behavioral consequences, meaning an action that benefits another at a cost to oneself, then it becomes inherently vulnerable to exploitation by selfishness. And he argues that altruism, in this sense, can only really evolve and be sustained when altruists are primarily interacting with other altruists.
Mm-hmm.
So think about a community, a group, where everyone is contributing, everyone is supporting each other.
Yeah, it's like in a group of givers, everyone benefits in the long run. It's sustainable.
Exactly. But Wilson, he points out this really important caveat. He says that even situations where altruism, on average, leads to more successful outcomes than selfishness across the group, individual altruists can still be exploited and harmed by those who are more selfish within that same group. So you can have this overall benefit of altruism at the group level. But individuals who are particularly altruistic, they might end up paying a higher price. And this leads him to define what he calls pathological social environments. These are environments that are structured in such a way that altruists are particularly vulnerable to this kind of exploitation.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's like a system where the more you give, the more likely you are to be taken advantage of.
Yeah, that's the basic idea. It's like a system that rewards selfishness and punishes altruism. And Wilson, he also raises this crucial point about different levels of social organization.
Mhm.
He gives this example of how altruism at one level, say within a family or a small community, can actually be exploited for selfish purposes at a higher level, like in conflicts between different groups or nations.
Yeah.
So you can have individuals who are incredibly altruistic towards their family members, their friends, their fellow citizens, but that same altruism can be harnessed, can be manipulated to fuel aggression and conflict towards those outside the group.
Oh, wow. So it's like that tribal loyalty, that in-group favoritism that Hauser was talking about, it can be this double-edged sword. It can foster cooperation and solidarity within the group, but it can also fuel conflict and hostility towards outsiders.
Precisely. It's all about context. And then finally, Wilson talks about altruism as a psychological phenomenon. He talks about the internal motivations that drive altruistic behavior, and he points out that these motivations can vary widely across individuals and cultures. And, he concludes by suggesting that our analysis of pathological altruism shouldn't stop here. It should extend to other traits that are associated with morality, with pro-social behavior, with the way that groups function.
Okay, so it's like this evolutionary perspective. It's encouraging us to take a more critical look at the potential downsides of other seemingly positive traits, not just altruism.
Wow, this has been incredibly insightful. All right, so now that we've kind of journeyed through these final chapters, let's try to bring it all together. Like,
Yeah.
what are the big overarching themes that emerge from all of this? All right, well, I think one of the most powerful themes is this tension between our individual motivations and the dynamics of the groups that we belong to. We see how our innate social nature, our desire for belonging, for connection, for acceptance, it can be a source of incredible cooperation and altruism. But as we've seen, it can also, under certain circumstances, lead to these really harmful outcomes.
Yeah, and it seems like these cognitive biases, like the self-deception that Hauser was talking about, they play this crucial role in pushing those altruistic tendencies towards the pathological. Like, it's not enough to just have these good intentions. If we're deceiving ourselves about the consequences of our actions, if we're not thinking critically about the potential harms, then those good intentions can actually lead us down a very dangerous path.
Exactly. These biases can really distort our perceptions, the way we see the world, the way we justify our actions, especially when they're combined with these strong emotional attachments to our in-groups or with deeply held beliefs about the righteousness of our cause. And then, of course, underpinning all of this, as Wilson so eloquently explained, is this whole evolutionary history of altruistic behavior. It's like a reminder that these traits, these behaviors, they evolved for specific reasons. And what might have been adaptive, what might have been beneficial for survival in one context, might not be so beneficial, might even be harmful in another context.
Yeah, it's like we can't just assume that because something is natural, because it's part of our evolutionary heritage, that it's always going to be good or beneficial. It really depends on the environment, on the context, on the specific situation.
Right. And I think these final chapters, they really connect back to a lot of what we've discussed earlier in this deep dive. Think about the whole concept of empathy-based guilt, for example. We talked about how that overwhelming feeling of responsibility for others, that intense empathy, it can sometimes lead to these self-neglecting behaviors, to enabling behaviors, to this kind of runaway empathy that almost mirrors Hauser's runaway process.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And what about codependency? We talked about how this inability to tolerate negative emotions in others, this need to fix everything, it can drive these self-sacrificing behaviors that ultimately harm both the altruist and the recipient. And, we also discussed self-righteousness, that unwavering belief in one's own moral superiority, and how that can fuel actions that, despite being driven by seemingly good intentions, can have these devastating consequences. It's like
Yeah.
all these pieces fit together, all these different threads weave into this larger tapestry of how altruism can go awry.
Yeah, exactly. It's a much more nuanced and complex picture than, just this simple equation of altruism equals good. And it really brings us to this central question. Is pathological altruism truly a paradox?
Yeah, because in many ways it does seem like a paradox. Like, how can the very intention to do good, to help others, be the starting point for something harmful?
Right. And, I think this book, and especially these final chapters, they really highlight this point. They emphasize that good intentions don't automatically guarantee a positive outcome. In fact, the road to hell, as they say, is often paved with good intentions. And these chapters, they provide us with some really valuable insights into the psychological, social, and evolutionary mechanisms that can create this disconnect between intention and consequence.
Yeah, so it's not about dismissing altruism altogether. It's about recognizing its complexities, understanding the specific conditions under which it can become problematic. It's about moving beyond just our individual motivations and considering the broader social and evolutionary context in which these actions take place.
Absolutely. It's a call for a more nuanced, more critical understanding of a behavior that we often, just blindly celebrate without really questioning its potential downsides.
All right, well, this has been a truly deep dive, that's for sure. And as we wrap up this final episode on pathological altruism, what would you say are some of the key insights, the big takeaways that you want listeners to remember from this exploration?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that altruism, while generally a very powerful and positive force in human society,
Mhm.
it has this more intricate, more complex, and potentially darker side than we often acknowledge. And the interplay of these strong in-group biases, cognitive distortions like self-deception, and the evolutionary underpinnings of our social instincts, all of these factors can create environments where well-intentioned actions can actually lead to these really harmful, even devastating results.
Yeah, it definitely challenges that simplistic equation of altruism equals good. It forces us to think more critically, more deeply about this whole concept.
Right. And I hope that this deep dive has encouraged listeners to really reflect on the implications of these insights, in their own lives, in their relationships, and in the world around them.
Absolutely. And it brings up this really crucial question, I think, for all of us to consider. Given these evolutionary roots and psychological mechanisms that we've explored, how do we as individuals and as a society cultivate genuinely beneficial altruism? How do we foster these helping behaviors, these compassionate actions in a way that's both effective and sustainable? How do we avoid falling into those traps of self-deception, of disproportionate sacrifice, of dehumanizing
Yeah, and
others?
those are the big questions, aren't they?
They really are, and I think they're questions worth pondering, worth exploring further. And maybe, just maybe, this deep dive has given our listeners a few new tools, a few new perspectives to help them grapple with those questions.
I hope so. It's a conversation that I think is essential for all of us if you want to understand ourselves and the world around us more fully.
Well said. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's certainly given me a lot to think about, and hopefully our listeners as well.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah,
And to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep those conversations going.
absolutely. All right, that's it for today, folks. Until next time, happy deep diving.